Over 2,000 years ago, two men played a key role in condemning Jesus Christ to death: Annas and Caiaphas. These two high priests were powerful figures in Jewish society at the time. They were part of the religious leaders who saw Jesus as a threat to their authority. They didn't just arrest him, but they worked with the Romans to make sure he was crucified. But what happened to them after Jesus' death? Did they face punishment for what they did? Annas was the former high priest, but he still had a lot of influence. His son-in-law, Caiaphas, was the current high priest, and it was Caiaphas who led the charge against Jesus. Together, they set in motion the trial that would ultimately lead to Jesus' crucifixion. They accused Jesus of blasphemy and handed him over to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, to be sentenced to death. But after Jesus' death and resurrection, the fate of Annas and Caiaphas became a mystery. Did they face God's wrath for their actions? Some believe they did, while others think they continued their lives in power. But one thing is clear: their involvement in Jesus' death had serious consequences, not just for them, but for the future of the world. As we dig deeper into their story, we'll explore their roles in Jesus' trial and the aftermath of their actions. Did they escape punishment, or did they face divine retribution for what they did? Stay with us as we uncover the tragic fate of the men who killed Jesus. In ancient Jewish society, the high priest held an important role. They were the religious leader of the Jewish people, responsible for leading the worship in the temple, offering sacrifices, and making decisions on spiritual matters. The high priest was considered the most powerful religious figure, and their authority was respected by both the people and the ruling Roman officials. Every year, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies, the most sacred part of the temple, to offer sacrifices for the sins of the people. Annas and Caiaphas were two high priests who played a crucial role in the events leading up to the death of Jesus Christ. Annas was the former high priest. He had served in the position for many years but was removed by the Roman authorities. Despite being removed, Annas still held significant power and influence. He was a respected leader among the Jewish people and continued to control many aspects of religious life, even though he was no longer officially in charge. His son-in-law, Caiaphas, had been appointed as the high priest, and it was under Caiaphas's leadership that the decision to arrest and condemn Jesus took place. Annas used his influence to guide and support Caiaphas, especially in matters related to Jesus. Caiaphas was the current high priest at the time of Jesus' trial. He was the one who publicly accused Jesus of blasphemy, which was a crime in Jewish law. Caiaphas was deeply concerned about Jesus' growing popularity among the people. Many believed that Jesus was the Messiah, the promised Savior of Israel, and this threatened the power and authority of the religious leaders, including Caiaphas. He feared that Jesus would cause unrest and rebellion, which could lead to the Roman authorities punishing the Jewish people. To protect their position and avoid any potential threat to their power, Caiaphas and Annas decided that Jesus had to be silenced. Their motivations for condemning Jesus were both political and religious. Politically, they wanted to maintain control over the people and avoid Roman retaliation. Religiously, they saw Jesus as a false teacher who was blaspheming and challenging their authority. They were willing to do anything, including turning to the Roman authorities, to have Jesus executed and protect their positions. Annas and Caiaphas played major roles in the trial and crucifixion of Jesus. They were key leaders who helped lead the charge against him, working closely with the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, and the Roman authorities to ensure that Jesus was condemned to die. The Sanhedrin was a group of Jewish religious leaders and judges who had authority over Jewish law. However, their power was limited because the Romans controlled the region. Despite this, they still had influence over spiritual matters and could make decisions about religious laws. Annas and Caiaphas used their position within the Sanhedrin to bring Jesus to trial. They wanted to stop Jesus because they feared he would lead a rebellion or disrupt the power they held over the Jewish people. Jesus' trial was a secret and unfair process. The high priests, along with the members of the Sanhedrin, gathered at night to secretly accuse Jesus. They didn't want the trial to be public because they feared the reaction of the people who supported Jesus. The charges against Jesus were based on lies and false witnesses. Some people were brought in to testify against him, but their stories didn't match up. This was an illegal trial because Jewish law required that trials be held during the day and that the accused be given a fair chance to defend themselves. Despite the false testimony, Caiaphas, the high priest, was determined to find Jesus guilty. He even asked Jesus directly, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" When Jesus answered, "I am," Caiaphas declared that he had blasphemed. This was enough for him to condemn Jesus to death, even though the evidence was not clear. Annas and Caiaphas saw Jesus as a huge threat to their power. Jesus had been gaining followers and challenging the religious system that the priests controlled. He was speaking about love, truth, and freedom from sin, which upset the religious leaders. They feared that if Jesus continued to preach, their authority would be undermined. To protect their own power, they decided it was better to kill Jesus. Caiaphas famously said, "It is better that one man die for the people," John 11:50. He meant that sacrificing Jesus would save the nation from the danger he believed Jesus posed. In his mind, it was better to get rid of one man than risk losing control over the people. This was a politically motivated decision to keep their power intact, even though it meant condemning an innocent man to death. After Jesus was crucified, the immediate aftermath shocked many, including Annas and Caiaphas. One of the most significant events was the tearing of the temple curtain. This curtain separated the Holy of Holies, the most sacred part of the temple, from the rest of the area. When Jesus died, the curtain tore from top to bottom, Matthew 27:51. Many believed this was a sign of divine judgment. The tearing of the curtain symbolized the end of the old way of worship and the beginning of a new covenant through Jesus. It meant that everyone, not just the high priest, could now have direct access to God. This event would have deeply troubled the religious leaders, as it showed that their authority and the temple system were no longer the focus of God's plan. Soon after Jesus' death, rumors began to spread that he had risen from the dead. This was the last thing Annas and Caiaphas wanted to hear. They thought they had solved the problem by having Jesus killed, but now they were faced with the possibility that Jesus was alive again. If this story spread, it would make Jesus' message even more powerful and would be a threat to their power. They couldn't allow this belief to grow. To suppress the rumors, Annas, Caiaphas, and the other religious leaders worked with the Roman authorities to cover up the resurrection story. The Roman guards who had been assigned to watch Jesus' tomb were bribed to spread a false story. According to Matthew 28:11-15, the guards were paid to say that Jesus' disciples had stolen his body while they were sleeping. The religious leaders and the Romans hoped this lie would stop people from believing that Jesus had risen from the dead. Despite their efforts to suppress the truth, the resurrection of Jesus became the cornerstone of Christianity. His followers boldly preached that he was alive, and the message spread quickly, even though the religious leaders tried everything they could to stop it. The actions of Annas and Caiaphas to cover up the resurrection only made the story of Jesus more powerful, as millions of people began to believe in him and the new hope he brought. After Jesus' death, the power and influence of Annas and Caiaphas began to crumble. Despite their efforts to stop the spread of Jesus' teachings, things started to change for them, and their control over the Jewish people weakened. One of the key reasons for their downfall was political turmoil. Caiaphas, who had been the high priest at the time of Jesus' trial, was eventually removed from his position by the Romans. The Roman authorities, who ruled over Judea at the time, had the power to appoint or remove high priests. Caiaphas had been a loyal servant to the Romans, but they no longer saw him as a useful leader. His involvement in the death of Jesus and his attempts to stop the spread of Christianity made him a liability. Eventually, the Romans replaced him with another high priest, and Caiaphas lost the power he once held. The Jewish historian Josephus also writes about the fall of Annas and Caiaphas. According to Josephus, their influence began to fade as their political and religious control weakened. Annas had been powerful, even though he was no longer the official high priest. However, the rise of the early Christian movement made their position more difficult. As more people followed Jesus and began to spread his message, the leaders who had condemned him began to lose their grip on power. They could no longer control the people in the same way they once had. Despite the efforts of Annas and Caiaphas to suppress the teachings of Jesus, the early Christian church continued to grow. Jesus' followers were fearless in preaching about his resurrection and the hope he offered. Many people began to believe in him, and the message of Christianity spread quickly. The Roman authorities, who had once been focused on maintaining order, started to recognize that the Christians were not a passing threat. Rather than being stopped, the Christian faith began to spread throughout the Roman Empire, despite the religious leaders' efforts to silence it. In the end, Annas and Caiaphas couldn't stop the message of Jesus. The early Christian church continued to grow, and their influence over the Jewish people faded. Their power had crumbled, and they were left with little control over the future of their people. After their role in condemning Jesus, many wonder if Annas and Caiaphas faced divine punishment for their actions. While there are no clear answers, there are several theories and historical accounts about what happened to them in their final years. Some legends suggest that Annas and Caiaphas met a violent or cursed end. These stories, though not found in the Bible, have been passed down through history. Some people believe that because they played a part in the death of Jesus, they were punished by God. According to some traditions, both men died in a violent way. These legends often reflect the belief that those who reject or harm God's plan face terrible consequences. However, there is no concrete historical evidence to confirm these stories, so we cannot be sure if they truly met such a fate. Other scholars believe that Annas and Caiaphas lived in disgrace. After their involvement in the trial and death of Jesus, their political and religious power began to fade. As mentioned earlier, Caiaphas was removed from his position as high priest by the Romans, which was a sign of his fall from grace. Both men were closely associated with the religious system that rejected Jesus, and as the Christian movement grew, their influence diminished. Some scholars suggest that they lived the rest of their lives in shame, knowing that their actions had led to the suffering of an innocent man and had failed to stop the rise of Christianity. Another important event that may have been seen as divine judgment was the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. This was a major turning point in Jewish history. The Roman army destroyed the temple, which had been the center of Jewish worship and the seat of the high priesthood. Some believe that this destruction was a direct judgment from God for the rejection of Jesus, particularly the role that Annas and Caiaphas played in his death. The temple's destruction could be viewed as the end of the old religious system and the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy that the temple would be torn down. Matthew 24:2. In conclusion, while we don't know for sure what happened to Annas and Caiaphas, many believe that their actions had consequences. Whether through disgrace, a violent end, or the destruction of the temple, their involvement in Jesus' death was significant, and some believe it led to divine punishment. The story of Annas and Caiaphas offers important lessons about power, pride, and the consequences of opposing God's will. Their actions show how the desire for power and the refusal to accept truth can lead to a person's downfall. One key lesson from their story is how power and pride led to their downfall. Annas and Caiaphas were high priests, which meant they held great influence over the Jewish people. They were in charge of religious matters and had the respect of the community. However, their pride in their position made them fearful of losing control when Jesus came on the scene. Instead of embracing the truth of who Jesus was, they saw him as a threat to their power. Their pride kept them from recognizing the opportunity to learn from him and grow. Instead of following the truth, they chose to defend their status, which ultimately led to their downfall. Another important lesson is the dangers of rejecting truth for political gain. Annas and Caiaphas were willing to ignore the truth of who Jesus was because they feared what his teachings could do to their political power. When Jesus performed miracles and taught about love, forgiveness, and salvation, it challenged the authority they had built. Rather than accepting the truth that Jesus was the Messiah, they chose to manipulate the situation for their own benefit. They worked with the Romans to have Jesus arrested, even though they knew he was innocent. This shows how rejecting the truth for selfish reasons can lead to destructive consequences, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole. Finally, their fate serves as a warning for those who oppose God's will. Annas and Caiaphas tried to stop God's plan by condemning Jesus, but their efforts were in vain. Despite their power and position, they could not prevent God's will from being fulfilled. Jesus rose from the dead, and his followers spread his message worldwide. The story of Annas and Caiaphas reminds us that opposing God's will is not only foolish, but dangerous. God's plans will always prevail, and those who try to stand in his way may face consequences they cannot avoid. In conclusion, the story of Annas and Caiaphas teaches us about the dangers of pride, the importance of accepting truth, and the consequences of opposing God's will. Their downfall serves as a warning for anyone who chooses to follow their own path instead of God's. But what do you think? Did Annas and Caiaphas face divine judgment for their role in Jesus' death? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If you enjoyed this video and want more content on biblical history, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. By subscribing, you'll stay updated with more fascinating stories and lessons from history. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.